roughly the same numbers of people that were leaving one setting of institutionalization, finding themselves in the criminal justice setting in jails and prisons. And a lot of the others who maybe did not end up in jails or prisons were finding themselves in situations of other bad outcomes. So victimization, homelessness, and definitely higher rates of suicide. I mean, even if it did actually produce a good effect, which it doesn't, it would be discriminatory on its face, and it should be repealed. It's a decision that people are making on a day-to-day basis, that they are not going to intervene when they can, or they're not going to use all of the treatment tools that are available. And that is the result. The result is that there are people who are out in the community who, definitely are at risk of being victimized, or definitely at risk of hurting others. So I'm Lisa Dailey. I'm the executive director of Treatment Advocacy Center. And before coming to Treatment Advocacy Center, I was an attorney of various different types. I previously had done trial work as a litigator, and then I've also done, kind of work in the human rights and civil rights space. I represented refugees for several years in asylum cases. And then I came to Treatment Advocacy Center because, in addition to being an attorney, I'm also a family member. I have a sibling with severe mental illness, which is why I've always been interested in the policy area. So that is how I came to Treatment Advocacy Center, which is an organization that is headquartered in the sort of the DC area. And our focus is on eliminating barriers to treatment for families that are affected by severe mental illness. And that can take on various different forms, but kind of the main thrust of our work is always focusing on that particular population. So as opposed to looking at kind of the broader spectrum of different kinds of mental health conditions or well-being issues, we're always focused on individuals with severe mental illness. So that can be schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anything that tends to have a component of psychosis.
So because you talked about severe mental illness, and you just mentioned a few examples. So for lay audience like myself, I have no idea the differences between just like a loose term mental illness. We hear that all the time, mental health disorder or severe mental illness. Like, can you tell us how we separate those terms?
Yeah, I mean, I would not say that within the advocacy space that there's, perfect consensus on, what terms should be used. What we do, and, since we particularly focus on this population, is we generally refer to severe mental illness or serious mental illness. And by that, we tend to mean individuals who have a condition that tends to have like a very pervasive effect on their ability to function on a day-to-day basis. And we do, kind of particularly focus on schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So that can be schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder, particularly bipolar 1. But we don't focus on some of the illnesses that are, maybe within what might be covered by some of the other advocacy groups, because we're very much specifically focused on individuals that have, kind of a very severe disability or a severe impact of their illness on their day-to-day functioning. So we tend to use the term mental illness as opposed to mental health condition or mental health, because in our view, there really is kind of a difference between, focusing on mental health or mental wellness and focusing on specific disorders and specific mental illnesses.
Do you know just maybe roughly how prevalent are those severe mental illness among the population?
I mean, there's not a perfect amount of consensus on this either, mostly because the federal government hasn't really done a great job of kind of collecting the data that you would need to have really accurate assessments. But generally, as a rule of thumb, we kind of assess that severe mental illness affects about 4% of the population.
Do you know roughly how prevalent severe mental illnesses are among the homeless population?
The data is kind of all over the map on that. But I would say that, the estimates tend to be low because of the difficulties that there are in collecting the data and getting accurate information from those that are actually interviewed. But we will generally, and you'll see that the estimates actually can be anywhere from like 30% to maybe 50% of people with homelessness or people affected by homelessness on even a periodic basis have, some form of a mental health diagnosis. But the prevalence of severe mental illness within that population is way higher than you would expect to see within the general population. So it is a very significant issue for that population.
So just now you talked about barriers for people with severe mental illness to get access to treatment. So that relates to a lot of people are thinking of the deinstitutionalization starting in the 1950s. So could you just like walk us back and then talk a little bit about the history starting in the 1950s?
Sure. So the 1950s is really sort of the top, like the peak of the number of beds that used to be available for treatment on an inpatient basis in the United States. So, and this is basically before you would have seen the widespread availability of a lot of medications that now have the ability to bring people out of psychosis. So the 50s, early mid 50s is sort of when we had the largest capacity for hospitalization within the country. And so that at its peak, and around 1955, it would have been somewhere around 550,000 beds that were available, which that's sort of the top end. And then like towards the end of the 50s, there was the development of a drug that had the ability to bring some people out of psychosis. That was thorazine, or the generic of it is chlorpromazine. And it really kind of stimulated a relook at policy and kind of an assessment of the idea that, hey, maybe people who have been, kind of living in long-term institutional settings may be able to return to the community, which, obviously is a good thing. And there were a lot of people that benefited from the availability of this antipsychotic medication that became, like I said, available in the late 50s. And so that sort of started that trend. And then on top of that, there were a lot of allegations of abuse and like bad conditions in some of the hospitals, which is definitely something that really is a part of the history of asylums. And those things in combination with sort of the personal interest that President Kennedy had in the idea of kind of converting the way that we do kind of have people treat, people that were treated on sort of a long-term institutional inpatient basis. That administration was very interested in trying to transition that population back into community integration. So this, in 1963, the Community Mental Health Act was passed. And that was, the goal of that was to sort of start to slowly, close the state facilities and the hospitals and kind of transition people into an inpatient or an outpatient setting or a community-based setting that was allowing people to be integrated into a less restrictive setting. That was the goal. And it's a good goal. But the issue, sort of what ended up happening is that the infrastructure that would have needed to have accompanied that in order to make people who were coming from a very high level of restrictiveness, like a very structured kind of an institutional setting, in order for that population to successfully transition into the outpatient setting, there were infrastructure needs that really didn't ever materialize. So what ended up happening is they did continue to close the hospitals because, almost immediately they realized that there was an enormous cost savings in closing those facilities. And it was a popular move because of some of, the bad image that the hospitals had because some of the abuses that have been reported. So really what you saw was sort of a flood of individuals who might normally have received treatment on an inpatient setting going into the communities without the available resources to make sure that they could succeed in those community-based settings. And this, it started happening in the 60s, and it really picked up speed, particularly in the 80s. Obviously, then Governor Reagan was one of the big drivers of that in California. And so we really started to see states closing those institutional facilities, their state hospitals, people returning to the communities, but not with an adequate kind of infrastructure built in order to support their needs. Some people were able to make a success of that, especially if they were able to respond to medications, but those with the higher needs tended to really sort of be left without adequate support to thrive in those settings. So you saw a lot of people who, were in the community without adequate support beginning to be encountered by the criminal justice system, by law enforcement. So what you really see is there's deinstitutionalization is one way to refer to it, but a lot of people refer to it as reinstitutionalization or transinstitutionalization. So basically you're releasing people from the inpatient hospital facilities And then, basically after a period of trying and failing within the community, a lot of people were finding themselves caught up in the criminal justice system. So you're seeing roughly the same numbers of people that were leaving one setting of institutionalization, finding themselves in the criminal justice setting in jails and prisons. And a lot of the others who maybe did not end up in jails or prisons were finding themselves in situations of other bad outcomes. So victimization, homelessness, and the definitely higher rates of suicide, and definitely like a lot of bad outcomes that were taking the place of being in an inpatient setting. And this, we went from the top end of the infrastructure that we had for hospital settings in the United States being around 550,000, going down to somewhere closer to about 36,000 for the entire population. So it went from there being, 330 roughly beds per 100,000 population in the country to only about 11 per 100,000 available in the community. So it really was it was a radical shift. It was a lost resource that has never recovered. And basically what we've got is the pendulum was way over here and it's swinging way over here. So we now have a situation where we have grossly inadequate resources to meet the needs of the population. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And it was based on, good intentions. But, one of the things that I think was not baked into that policy that, obviously was not intentional, but, there's roughly, maybe up to a third of those with severe mental illness don't actually respond to existing medication. So it was based on really optimistic ideas about what you'd be able to accomplish just with the availability of new medications. And it just really wasn't borne out by what was actually likely to, people's experience didn't match what we were hoping their experience would be when they made those transitions. So really what we ended up with was a community system that is inadequately built for the needs of those who really rely on it.
You mentioned President Kennedy signed the Mental Health Services Act in the 60s. Oftentimes when I talk with experts, they mention Reagan when he was the governor of California and how he started the deinstitutionalization, which was actually not true. So it started way earlier than that.
It did actually. That was actually one of the last bills that Kennedy signed, and it was something that had a very important place in his life because of the experience that he had with his own sibling with severe mental illness. So, I mean, the intentions were definitely good. The intentions were to have people returning from institutional settings to the community where they could receive adequate care. Just didn't translate into an adequate system being created and built to actually meet the needs of the people that were going to be returning to the communities. And we've just never caught up with that. We never really have built the system that was needed for people to receive community-based care.
So what kind of community-based care ideally should be built?
Well, one of the buzzwords that you'll hear a lot these days, but which is a very accurate kind of description, is the continuum of care. So you really need to have a lot of different things available to meet the needs of the different people who will encounter the system. So there are definitely people who can do just fine if there are just outpatient services available that you can seek when you need them, and that can be having adequate access to medication, adequate ability to access therapy or access, talk therapy, the different kinds of things that are available that on a community or an outpatient basis, which are, generally are sort of either parallel to or within the medical system. And like there are many people who can do just fine with that, but then there are people that have more acute needs. So you definitely may have the need on the occasional basis to be able to, be seen on an inpatient basis, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, depending on what's going on in your treatment situation. And there are like some of those resources available in our current continuum of care, but there's not nearly enough. So what ends up happening is that you get these bottlenecks where there are people who really need to get into inpatient treatment in order to be evaluated for medication, or need to be able to continue seeing a psychiatrist in order to maintain their medication. We need to have ability to have insurance so that they can cover their medication, because these medications are very expensive. And all of those things need to be in place for an individual to, kind of do what you would consider to be the normal trajectory. Is that a person, say a person with severe mental illness needs to be evaluated, they need to be diagnosed, they need to be stabilized on the treatment that they need, which is usually some sort of a medication. They need to have an ongoing relationship with a psychiatrist and medical doctor to be able to be monitored and to ensure that they're on the correct medication, the correct dosages, and they need to have insurance so that they continue to receive care. And then occasionally there may be acute needs that require the availability of a crisis stabilization unit or a hospital setting for that person to continue to receive the care that they need at the time that they need it. So that's what's needed in the community. And there's some element of most of those things in most communities. There just isn't nearly enough. And what is kind of a bigger issue is that the pieces of those different, components of the system do not operate as a system. So it's like there's sort of fragmented services that are available, but these are really parts that don't function as a whole. So there's a lot of holes within the system where a person who's navigating that system can fall out and, just, become removed from the system, not have access to what they need. Or get stuck in a waiting list and not be able to access things because it's just not available. So that's kind of what is missing from the system, is to have a sufficient number of programs and services that are available, and to have those things function as an actual system.
So you mentioned cost. I'm just curious for individuals and their families who suffer from severe mental illnesses, if they were to seek professional care, how much are they looking at roughly?
Well, it really depends on, obviously our health system is extraordinarily complicated in this country, and that is true for mental health services, just as it is for other kinds of health services. So it really sort of depends on whether or not you have private insurance, whether or not you rely on Medicaid, whether or not you rely on Medicare. So basically what the cost is depends a lot on whether or not you are covered by an insurer who has the ability to negotiate prices. But if you're an uninsured person, if you're just looking at what the bottom line cost is, it depends quite a bit in terms of like what a therapist might charge, or what your medication costs might be. But we do know that basically the average cost for a psychiatric hospitalization is just over about $11,000 per, kind of incident, which is, that's one of those things that is a little bit different for individuals who are kind of navigating the mental health system as opposed to the health system, because a lot of times those hospitalizations are not covered by your insurance if you're relying on Medicaid because of the IMD exclusion. And then also, private insurers have kind of a lengthy track record of attempting to, get out of paying a lot of that kind of thing. That there are parity laws, but they're not as enforced as they might be. So the cost is really kind of all over the place, and it depends a lot on what you rely on for your coverage.
So 11,000 for one stay, for one inpatient stay, hospitalization.
That's the average, yeah.
And then that's probably just several days to up to a month, or like how long is it?
I would say that the average stay is usually somewhere around maybe 7 days, 5 to 7 days.
That's expensive for anyone, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's like healthcare costs are quite expensive one way or the other. But the difference is just that there are a lot of missed opportunities to prevent things from going to the hospital level. So it really is, that's an expensive level of care, and it's a level of care that is often not covered by an individual's insurance provider.
Right. So if the community-based care is there, and then for people who can maybe seek care at the community level to prevent them from going to the hospital and they use very expensive treatment, right? So that would probably be a less expensive way to go.
Right. That, and I mean, obviously, if somebody ends up in the criminal justice system, that is also a very expensive way to receive care. And, obviously it's not very effective either.
Right, exactly. So you mentioned IMD, and could you tell us, a lot of people are not familiar with the term. So it stands for the Medicaid Institutions for Mental Diseases Exclusion. So can you talk about the background of IMD exclusion and why was the IMD exclusion signed into law, and then the intentions at the time?
Yeah, so basically the IMD exclusion is it's part of the law that created Medicaid. So it actually goes all the way back to the beginning of Medicaid, which is 1965. And it was always part of that law. So what the exclusion actually says is relatively simple, but it has, a very like pervasive effect on our ability to provide care for those with severe mental illness. So what it actually says is that Medicaid funds cannot, even if you're a person who has eligibility for Medicaid, those funds can't be used to pay for your treatment if that treatment is in an IMD, an institution for mental disease. So that would basically be, what that means is like, it's a hospital that is providing psychiatric care primarily if that facility has more than 16 beds. So that's going to be most state facilities. I mean, basically, when you think of the state hospital, or if you think of what used to be referred to as an asylum, that's an IMD, and all care within those facilities is restricted and prohibited under the act that created Medicaid. So the purpose of it was, at the time, the idea was that they didn't want to federalize those costs. So they wanted to have the states remain on the hook for paying for those costs. They didn't want to have that become a federalized expense. It was sort of predicated in the idea that the states would retain that sense of responsibility for that population, that they would recognize that, okay, the feds aren't going to be paying for these, but that's a cost that we have traditionally borne. But what actually ended up happening is that states began to recognize that it was often a politically popular decision to close hospitals because of some of the backlash that was happening because of poor treatment that people received, or because of overcrowding, or because of abuses that had happened, that were coming to light in the 60s at the time that, the Medicaid law was being written. So states started, closing these facilities, and they realized that not only is this a popular decision, but it saves us a ridiculous amount of money. So there were really no incentives for states to continue to pay for these facilities, because it was popular to close the hospitals, and it was also, saving them a lot of money. So the intention behind excluding it at the federal level was to ensure that remained a state responsibility. It's just not something that they had the ability, basically when the states started closing facilities and stopped wanting to invest in those costs, there really wasn't anything that could prevent that from happening. And that's kind of where we are right now, is that a lot of the state budgets kind of are not predicated around the idea that they're going to expand any of those services, that they're going to pay more. And that, really the trend, despite the fact that, I think, when you read most articles, or you kind of hear about this, most people will talk about how there's not enough hospital beds, there's a dearth of hospital beds available, but the trend is actually still going in the other direction, to close facilities rather than to open up new beds, because it's a high cost. It costs a lot to fund a state psychiatric hospital. And when states basically saw that only this one kind of hospital facility, we bear the entire cost for that, you can't supplement it in any way with federal funds the way that we do for really every other kind of healthcare that has Medicaid available as a payer. The natural result was that having the IMD exclusion in place led to more closures and the loss of hospital beds, and there just being far less available in terms of resources for people who rely on inpatient services, which, from basically what we found is that really disproportionately impacts those that have severe mental illnesses, who do occasionally have the need for an acute care setting.
We usually associate Medicaid with the financial help for people with disability, right? And I never thought mental illness would be excluded from the disability category. So isn't that like a discrimination?
I certainly think so. I mean, it is literally the only kind of condition that is subject to this exclusion. There's no other kind of condition, no other kind of physical kind of condition, and that is affected in this way. It's the one thing that has been singled out as we're not going to pay for this. And we do believe that that is unacceptably discriminatory. There's absolutely, I mean, even if it did actually produce a good effect, which it doesn't, it would be discriminatory on its face, and it should be repealed, definitely.
So at the beginning, the federal government was hoping the state government will pick up the bill, right? Will continue to pay for people's mental health treatment. But then the states didn't do that because it was very expensive. In California, in particular, we know in 2004, California passed the Mental Health Services Act, which collects 1% income tax on mainly all the millionaires, right? And so that's a lot of tax revenue. However, even after 2004, we continue to see psychiatric facilities and beds decline. And so why does the new tax revenue not making any difference?
There's a couple things going on there, and they have more to do with oversight and management than anything else, because it is true that passage of Prop 63 actually did lead to collection of like enormous amounts of funds that should be available, and that ordinance was very clear that it was intended to be for people with severe mental illness, and I would say that the reason that you haven't seen that, there have been a number of attempts by different entities within California to sort of look at what's going on with that. So like there's a little Hoover Commission. There have been reports that have gone, that have sort of come to the same conclusions. And really, so what's going on there is a lot of those funds are not really being applied towards those with the most severe mental illnesses. And that's largely because there are inadequate oversight mechanisms that were built into it, so that money is kind of being sent in places where it really wasn't intended to go. So for like treatment for people with less severe types of mental illness, there's not really like a requirement that you evaluate those programs to make sure that they're actually, evidence-based. But a lot, it was also discovered not that long ago that a lot of the counties are just kind of sitting on those funds. It's like they're there and they could be used to expand treatment capacity and to like build beds or like make, basically whatever would work under the language of that law, to contribute towards the care of those with severe mental illness. But you'll find that for whatever reason, a lot of the localities are just kind of sitting on those funds. And there's probably going to need to be some sort of additional like beefed up oversight at the state level to try to ensure that they're not stockpiling those funds, that they actually are spending them on the population they're intended to be spent on. And somebody probably needs to be empowered with the ability to kind of make decisions about, no, this doesn't count. This isn't something that you shouldn't be using funds for this. And that just doesn't exist within it right now. It's a very, it has an inadequate mechanism of oversight, and a lot of people have kind of pointed to that, but it may require legislative action in order to put that oversight in place.
Are there any other states in the country that have sort of like going the opposite way and building more psychiatric facilities and beds?
I mean, there are definitely states that have more beds per 100,000 than California. California is definitely on the very low end in terms of what's actually out there and what's available for those that would need it on the civil side. But so like for example, I mean, there are, I think one of the states that has a relatively high percentage compared to other states is Mississippi. Has like more beds that are available for the population compared to other states, but none of them have anywhere near what we would recommend. And so, which, basically based on, kind of up-to-date information about how many people might have a need of an acute hospitalization at some point, the recommendation is that there be, about 50 per 100,000. So 50 beds per 100,000 people in your population, and you use that to sort of calculate what should you have available. And actually none of the states come anywhere near that. There's really just a dearth of hospital beds that are available really in all of the states. There are some states that are getting closer, but they're You know, I mean, states are pretty reluctant to put that expense in. And they a lot of times have workforce issues as well. So it's something that continues to be a struggle for really all the states, although obviously some of them have done a better job of managing their resources than others.
It seems to me it's also very politically sensitive, right? So people don't want to even mention mental hospitals or asylums because it kind of reminds people of the history in the past. But then how do we even go there if for some academics and policymakers, reopening state hospitals, increasing psychiatric beds is a non-starter?
I mean, I don't agree that it is a non-starter, because I do think that people see the bad effects of not having beds available every day. You know, when you walk down the street and you see somebody who is in dire physical shape, or somebody who's in an active psychosis on the street and they're suffering, it is not hard to put together in your mind that like this is happening because there's not a treatment bed available, or there's not enough treatment beds available so that we feel like we can actually intervene with this individual. So, I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that we could get to the point that people do actually recognize we need to build more beds, we need to have facilities available. And they don't all need to be state facilities. I mean, like there are a lot of different kinds of beds. You can make beds available that are, you know, for crisis services. You can make beds available that are, you know, part of permanent supportive housing. Those are all beds, and they're things that really just need to be planned for within the community. But I will definitely say that you're absolutely correct that whenever there's a suggestion that we want to look at expanding our facility of inpatient beds that would be available either for voluntary or involuntary hospitalizations, there is always pushback, always. And there are a lot of people who feel very strongly about that, and I understand why they feel strongly about that. I guess I would just urge anyone making that argument to think about the fact that there are people who are doing a lot more poorly than they are who need those beds, and they should maybe consider that before speaking on behalf of everyone who might be, you know, potentially eligible for a bed.
We saw horrendous crimes committed by homeless people in subways and other public spaces in recent years. So for example, we saw one incident maybe 2 weeks ago, right, in New York City, where someone was pushed off the subway and got killed by a train. So could you tell us where we are in cities like New York City and San Francisco on preventing similar crimes from happening again?
I mean, I would say that, I mean, most of the time there are laws that are in place that could have been used to prevent those kinds of things from happening. I mean, there definitely there's room for improvement in all of the statutes. There's room for improvement in New York statute. It's not very well defined what you mean by who poses a danger to themselves or to someone else. And maybe if you provided some additional information about who you intend as the legislature to be within that definition, that might help. And that's also true in California. You could be more explicit about who do you intend as the legislature. If somebody is going to be evaluated for whether or not they pose a danger to themselves or someone else, what do you mean by that? Who do you actually mean? And at what level of disability are you talking about? Additional clarity is probably needed in some states to do better at actually kind of identifying who should be, you know, somebody who is appropriate for intervention. But really, a lot of it is sort of the willpower to use those laws to the extent that you can and should. And really, that's kind of what happened in New York. I mean, there are tools that are available under New York law, but I have not heard anything that suggests that that individual, that man who was involved in that incident, you know, was really involved or enrolled in any kind of a program, despite the fact that he had been incarcerated, he had been hospitalized. So, I mean, definitely he was on the radar of people who would have been in a position where they maybe could have filed a petition to have continuing, you know, supervision within the community to ensure that he was receiving the kind of robust services that he might have needed to be safely within the community. And it's not just a question of whether or not he poses a danger to other people, which in that case, he obviously did pose a danger to other people, but people who are untreated or undertreated out in the community are also very much at risk for being victimized. And that is that's something that it's a decision that people are making on a day-to-day basis, that they are not going to intervene when they can, or they're not going to use all of the treatment tools that are available And that is the result. The result is that there are people who are out in the community who, definitely are at risk of being victimized or definitely at risk of hurting others. It's a status quo that we've kind of allowed, but it isn't necessarily based on problems with the treatment laws themselves. I mean, you can always beef those up. You can always make sure that they adequately, convey what is intended by the legislature. But a lot of it comes down to the willpower of those who use those treatment tools to decide that they are going to use them when they should. If you see an individual, who is in the community and who is muttering to themselves, or somebody who is floridly psychotic, that's a person who you probably could intervene with under existing laws if you want to. So some of it is maybe inconsistent application of those laws. So like a police officer might look at that individual on the street and believe that they meet criteria and should be hospitalized. But then if they bring them to the emergency department and the physician doesn't agree and just releases that person, that's going to impact whether that cop is likely to bring somebody in again. So it's really, it's not just about what the laws actually are. It's about how they're being applied, and resources are very much related to that. So I mean, if there were enough hospital beds that were available, you probably wouldn't see people making these calls where people who are still very sick are being released. They're being released because there aren't places for them to go.
But like, what can we do? That emergency room doctor says, well, we have no facility, we have no beds upstairs, so the only way for you to go is to go back to the street. So, other than increasing the beds.
So, I mean, really, what's actually happening there, there's two things that could be happening there. It could be that the person who is making the determination at the emergency room is saying, I don't have facilities available. But if a person meets criteria, you're not allowed to release that person because you don't have a bed available. So what's actually happening is they're really kind of mentally thinking this person doesn't meet criteria, but it's influenced by whether or not you have a bed available. So, I mean, person who meets criteria, you're not supposed to release. So it really is like you're kind of, people are sort of being conditioned to think that people don't meet criteria because there aren't resources available, but it's not, so that's part of what's going on. But also there's, people who work in medical settings are not lawyers and they're not lawmakers, and neither are police officers. So some of it is, a training issue where it's like, maybe do we have robust training for physicians who work in emergency room to, because most of the people who make that determination are not psychiatrists. They are usually, residents working in an emergency room who have had maybe 8 hours of psychiatric training as part of their training. I mean, like, is that enough? Maybe not. Maybe if you're going to be working in an emergency room, you do have to have a better understanding of what stabilized actually means for this population. And like, you definitely some biases and for individuals who kind of assume, well, if this, this person isn't physically sick, so I'm just going to release this person because I want to save beds for people who have a physical illness, without kind of recognizing that these are physical illnesses. I mean, this is not a person, it's not a choice that a person is making. That is a physical ailment that can be aided by care and medication and compassionate treatment. And that's part of it too, and this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before, that we have these different pieces of a system, but they don't work together. So like, we don't do trainings that encompass, having the person, the law enforcement officer who has to make the first determination about whether or not somebody seems to meet criteria. They're not receiving training with the individual at the emergency room, who is also going to make a decision about whether or not that person meets criteria. And that training maybe should be done together so that they coordinate. I mean, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, it is traumatic to intervene with an individual on the street who does not want to be hospitalized. That is a traumatic event for that person. And so for you to, as a law enforcement person, to make the decision that you're going to do that, you're not going to do that if you're not relatively confident that that person will be admitted if you bring them to the hospital. So it really has to do with, this system needs to function like a system, and it really isn't being designed to do that. We're not really kind of making sure that, most of the time law enforcement doesn't know doesn't know the people that they might be seeing at the emergency department. Emergency department may not know the psychiatrist who makes the decision if they get admitted. They may not have like a really smooth coordination for whether or not that person should be subject to a petition for further inpatient care or for further outpatient care. And it's just because of the fact that it doesn't function that way, there's just a lot of opportunities for a person to fall out of the system at any step along the way where it's not functioning like a system. And every time that happens, that person is back to square one. And it's dangerous. The more times an individual has a failed or a really negative experience, the less likely that they're going to be to seek voluntary care, because they won't associate law enforcement or emergency rooms with good care.
So I would like to ask you something about the Laura's Law. Can you tell us what it is and how it applies to our society today?
Yeah, so Laura's Law is, it's what in California you use to refer to what we call assisted outpatient treatment or outpatient civil commitment. And what it's calling it that is sort of new, but it's actually not that new of a treatment tool. In some states, it's always been available or it's always been part of the system. But what it basically is that if an individual, if they meet certain criteria, that they can be court ordered to continue treatment on an outpatient basis in the community. And it's like it depends. Like each state kind of has their own set of rules about how you qualify for it and what it actually looks like and how it operates. But in California, basically requires that an individual either, has a particular treatment history that identifies, like, hey, this person has failed to continue treatment a number of times after being hospitalized or after being incarcerated. So we're identifying that treatment adherence is a problem. And for this particular individual, if they don't continue their treatment, it's likely that they're going to get sick enough to then again qualify to be hospitalized, or even worse, that they might be arrested. So it's basically creating a situation that allows you to look at a person's treatment history and making an assessment about whether or not they should be under court order to continue their treatment. So it's basically like, it's community system, it's a community-based treatment, but it is under a court order and under the supervision of a judge who's watching that docket. And it's two ways. So it's basically the judge is basically ordering the individual, yes, you have to continue to follow your treatment plan. And it's also ordering, the treatment team and the county behavioral health system, you can't drop this person. We have identified this person as being, somebody who is prioritized for treatment. So you have to continue providing treatment for this individual, which is one of the things that I think sometimes gets left out about it. It's not just about ordering an individual to be treated. It's also ordering the system to continue treating and prioritizing that individual based on their treatment history.
For the man who committed a crime 2 weeks ago in New York subway, so that he's homeless, and who would bring him to the judge to make an assessment? And then even if the judge makes assessment and then say he needs to receive community treatment, he's homeless. Like, who is going to follow him around?
Well, in his case, I mean, and this is actually fairly common for a person. Like, if you were looking at somebody who is unhoused and who is floridly psychotic, it may be that person requires a period of inpatient stabilization first. Because, most of the time, especially with somebody with schizophrenia or with another psychotic disorder, a lot of times what you're going to need to stabilize is you're probably going to need medication. And that doesn't happen on an outpatient basis. Especially, involuntarily, that doesn't happen on an outpatient basis. So certainly if that individual meets criteria, then, a person might be hospitalized, might be stabilized on medication. And that is a great time to discharge that person outpatient, because then there are resources that are available to help that person find a home. And then there's a requirement that the county continue to follow that individual and give him what he needs in order to, remain on his treatment path, stay stable, avoid going off medication, and avoid becoming homeless. So it's a tool that can not only prevent homelessness from occurring, but if you refer somebody for evaluation who is homeless, it can result in that person being evaluated, possibly hospitalized, and stabilized, and then can help them get into, supportive housing programs as part of Laura's Law. Laura's Law isn't what they call it in New York, but it's the same basic idea. Laura's Law is sort of based on what the original program was in New York, which is called Kendra's Law.
In California, I read that not all counties have signed up for that.
That's true. The way that it was passed for Laura's Law was it was passed as an opt-in law. So basically it was available, but in order to make use of that law, the Board of Supervisors in every county actually had to make a vote that they were going to opt in to use that ordinance and to launch a program. And for a long time, it was fairly slow, the trickle of counties that were sort of jumping in and deciding to use that. It certainly helped when it was clarified that that MHSA funds could be used for Laura's Law under certain parameters. But then actually not that long, I think it was 2 years ago now, there was a bill that passed that actually switched it from being opt-in to being opt-out. So we're actually going to see pretty soon, this coming July, we're going to see the launch of several new programs now that it's no longer an opt-in program. So now there's still some counties that have opted out, and for those counties, it is not available for those citizens. But it's the hope is that increasingly, as there's additional data coming out showing the successes of the other programs, that eventually all counties will be using this tool to try to make sure that it's at least an option for those who really need it. It's not intended for all individuals that have mental illness or even severe mental illness. It's for a relatively targeted population that can really benefit from the additional robust support from the counties.
Thank you. So earlier you mentioned policemen and ER doctors need to have some more training about the criteria for who to be brought to inpatient care, right? So are those criteria related to Laura's Law, or are they related to some other regulations available?
So what I was referring to in that case, those are inpatient and emergency evaluation criteria. So in California, that's like the 5150 and the 5250 criteria. And Leonard, it's the LPS criteria that are relevant when you're looking at whether or not an individual should be brought into an emergency room to be given an evaluation to see if they meet criteria, and then the decision that you're making about whether or not they meet the criteria in order to be admitted for longer term inpatient hospitalization. And by longer term, I mean, like 7 to 10 days in most states. Those are part of the inpatient or emergency evaluation criteria, and that's different from Laura's Law. They usually, not all states have separate criteria, but a lot of them do, and California is one of those, where the criteria that you would meet in order to qualify for Laura's Law are different than what you would need to qualify for in order to be hospitalized. And the reason for that is because Laura's Law is basically a requirement that you continue to adhere to treatments, but you're on an outpatient basis. So it's a significantly lower intrusion upon your civil rights. So you're telling somebody to do something, but you're not physically putting them inpatient someplace. So the criteria are commensurate with like the level of intrusion into somebody's civil liberties that you're looking to impose.
And also in LA County, they reported a 350% increase in the number of incompetent to stand trial IST cases between 2010 and 2015. This is also from your article, Treat or Repeat. So why is that? Is it because the diagnoses are getting more, relaxed or laxer, or is it because more people with mental health illnesses were involved in the criminal justice system?
I actually think there's a couple of things that are going on there, and research can tell us a little bit about what's happening, although some of it is you kind of have to, pull some inferences out of those things. But so part of what's going on there is that the criminal justice system is becoming better at identifying when a person who has been swept into the criminal justice system is really there because they have untreated mental illness. And as a result, they're doing a better job of kind of flagging that person and saying, we could treat this person as a regular person on our docket, as a criminal justice offender. But because we can tell that what's going on here is really that person has untreated mental illness, we are going to send them to be evaluated about whether or not they're really competent to proceed. So part of it, I mean, which is actually a good thing. I mean, it means that the criminal justice system is doing a better job of like really taking into consideration that some of the individuals who are being swept into the criminal justice system don't belong there. They're there because they have untreated, unmet health needs. So that's part of it, is that they're doing a better job of kind of recognizing who is, before, you know, the judge can see that the person in front of them is really not somebody who had a criminal intent or even a criminal capacity. It's somebody who has an unmet need, and they have not been treated for something, and that might have caused them to engage in behavior that could be considered criminal, but could also be considered symptomatic of an untreated illness. So that's part of what's going on. But another thing that's going on, and there's research that's been done in California that bears this out, is that there's a certain amount of, so basically the research that I'm talking about really measured for people who are being, entering the criminal justice system. They were looking at the person's history, and they found what over time, a person was more likely to have been previously arrested. Somebody who's in the IST system, they're more likely to have been previously arrested than previously hospitalized. And what that points to is that increasingly the mental health system is kind of choosing not to become involved with individuals who used to be sort of their clients. They're passing on the decision to get involved and to, intervene on the health side or on the, social services side. And they're, kind of, those people are becoming invisible to that system, so that the first time that they're encountering anyone, it's in the criminal justice system, which that's really kind of exactly what we mean when we say that that mental illnesses are becoming criminalized. So the system that should be dealing with that population is the mental health system and the health system. And because people are not encountering that system at the time when they should, they're becoming more symptomatic, and they're in the community and symptomatic and untreated for a long enough period that they're more likely to then be interacting with law enforcement, which can lead to them being arrested and put in jail or put in prison. So it's really sort of neglect of that population by who really should be serving them, which is the health and mental health system.
I know your organization is working on assertive outpatient treatment, so AOT. Is that something that you're actively working on right now, or is that something that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of our big focuses. Our position, which is borne out by the evidence, is that AOT, which it's assisted outpatient treatment, and that's the thing that can be called lots of different things. So like Laura's Law is one example, Kendra's Law is what they call it in New York. Some places just call it AOT, some call it outpatient civil commitment, but it's all basically the same thing. It's basically like adding a layer of court supervision to somebody's outpatient treatment plan to ensure that they succeed and that the system doesn't drop that person, and that they continue to receive the services that have been identified by treatment providers as being necessary for that person to safely, kind of thrive in the community. And it's our position, and is borne out by the evidence of the research that's been conducted, that it is a very powerful tool in both making sure that people continue to succeed in the community, but preventing some of those bad outcomes that I mentioned. So if you are robustly engaged in services, and if somebody is aware of whether or not you're doing okay and is ensuring that services that you're entitled to are being provided to you, you're much less likely to then get caught up in the revolving door of the emergency room system. You're much less likely to be rehospitalized. You're a lot less likely to be arrested. You're more likely to remain in housing, so you're less likely to be homeless. You have resources available, so you're less likely to be victimized by somebody, because there are a lot of settings where somebody's really at risk for victimization, and you're less likely to be in those settings if you're under an AOT order and receiving the care that you need to. It's both something that can help a person stabilize and then also prevent them from being likely to fall into some of the more poor outcomes. So we provide technical assistance to programs all over the country. And we also do scholarly research about that and kind of advocate for additional funds at the federal and at the state levels to just kind of make it available as a regular tool that's available. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all the problems that people have. It's only really something that we know really helps a particularly vulnerable population, segment of the population. So it's people that, it's intended to be narrowly focused on those who really need it to survive at, the best possible level in the community. So we definitely support that it should be available to everyone. It's a tool that should be available to everyone, and people should have that. It should be something that their family, can refer to, and you can ensure that there's some method of accountability for the mental health system, which is, kind of my favorite aspect of it, is that it provides, it does provide a layer of accountability for the mental health system. And there's not very many things that you can really use to trigger going to court and saying, hey, I'm supposed to be receiving transportation to get to my appointments and I'm not, and then the judge can order that the county live up to its end of the bargain. And that's very empowering for individuals that have maybe not had a very responsive system to deal with in the past.
So who are you partnering with right now in terms of AOT movement? Are you partnering with nonprofits or government to provide?
Well, it depends. It depends on how it's set up. So, I mean, in California, we have partnered with. So, California has some counties will have full service providers that they kind of outsource that care to, and like we have contracts where we have worked with those, with full service providers to help them in the design of their program and kind of make sure that they're using the tools the way that they're intended to get the best results. We definitely partner with counties. We can partner with, we definitely have in some places have partnered with law enforcement who are looking to use it as a tool of diversion to get people out of the criminal justice system and into the civil system, or people who are being released from carceral settings, to ensure that people remain hooked up with services when they are released, so that they're more likely to succeed and recidivism is less of a concern. So really any entity, there are a lot of different ways that you can implement a program. It sort of depends on how your state is set up, and like whether it's a county service or a state service, or whether it's something that's contracted out to private providers, which some states do it that way. So we'll partner with anyone who's trying to roll out a program to ensure that they set it up in a way that is the most likely to result in the person who's enrolled in it succeeding.
Do you receive any pushbacks at the local level?
We sometimes do, but usually I would say that there sometimes is a reluctance to try it. We have never so far really had any kind of an example where like an entity decided to roll out a program and then they hated it and decided not to do it. It's really just, there's people who kind of know what it is, and they usually really see the good results and think it's worthwhile. And then there's people that have maybe misinformation about what it is and maybe have some concerns about it. And there can definitely be pushback about getting started with it. But generally, once people kind of see the results and the good outcomes that people are having, that kind of resistance tends to go away. And generally people who are enrolled, and this is one of my favorite statistics that I like to trot out, is that, we were involved in providing technical assistance for a federal pilot that was funding a bunch of different programs, one of which was in California, that we were involved in the technical assistance side of, kind of rolling out these programs that were funded under this federal program. And they did a measure of the people who were enrolled in the programs, and 92% of them agreed with the statement, or strongly agreed with the statement, that they liked the services that they received, and they didn't feel coerced to be in the program, which is, I think when people start to see what it actually is like to be in that program, and the fact that it's intended to be a support for the individual, a lot of that reluctance tends to go away.
I'm wondering whether there are any prospect of AOT working with permanent supportive housing.
Oh, I mean, certainly. I mean, like, there's absolutely nothing that would prevent that from happening. It really just a question is, and that's again that thing where you've got these different pieces. Like, permanent supportive housing is a piece of the system, and it's not working collaboratively with the other pieces of the system, but it can. And there are definitely examples where they have set it up so that there is a relationship between the AOT program and the housing, so that like they can communicate with one another, and they can if something seems to be going wrong, you can check in with one another and see like what can we do that can help with this. Do we need to go, do we need to like set an appointment, see if somebody needs some additional care? there are ways to do that, and and it should work that way. I mean, housing is a key part of a person's ability to be stable, and it's definitely the case that an ideal, kind of package, when you put together a treatment plan for an individual, having a stable housing situation is a big part of what can help a person to succeed.
But actually, putting them in housing without supportive services is setting them up for failure, right? If you just put them in an independent room and with nobody to talk with.
Like, I know a lot of people have kind of heard anecdotally about people who maybe where housing was made available and the person wouldn't stay in the housing. I mean, a lot of times that might be because their mental illness is not treated. So they have, maybe a delusional reason why they don't want to be in the housing. So, I mean, you really should try to ensure that a person is able to make the best use of those resources by trying to address, you do need to address the mental health issues that the person is facing, or the substance abuse issues that the person might be facing, in order to make sure that they can succeed. And I know it's a very complex problem, and I certainly recognize that everybody who works in this area has the best of intentions, and they really, care about this population. It's just, basically for the population that we are the most concerned of, for people with severe mental illness, the idea that you can address some of those issues while ignoring their needs for severe mental illness is just proven to be, something that is not a recipe for success.
Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. I feel like I've learned so much from you in the last hour. And I just really want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. And I really hope that your organization will succeed in promoting more assisted outpatient treatment so that more people around the country can get access to mental health treatment that they need.
Well, thank you so much for your interest in the issue. We are very focused on California right now because, like I said, there's a lot of new programs. So we're anticipating, really, pushing up our sleeves and being very involved in what's going on in California. And, we're seeing a lot of, everybody in California cares a lot about this issue. We just really need to get, kind of on the same page about how to do our best for this population.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.